Good evening, everyone. A little louder, please. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. My name is Frank Guridy. I am a professor of history and African American and African diaspora studies here at Columbia. I am also the executive director of the Eric H. Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights, and I am delighted to be here with you tonight. And I want to welcome you to our first event of the year. Created in 2017, the Holder Initiative aims to inspire our undergraduate students to draw upon their superior liberal arts education to do impactful political and civic engagement work during their time here at Columbia and beyond. Through the creation of timely and innovative programming, the sponsorship of student projects and internships, and the creation of a justice-oriented curriculum, the Holder Initiative aims to cultivate a broad conception of justice, one that seeks to empower students to address the many challenges of our time. Indeed, there are no shortage of challenges facing us today that students can use their experience here at Columbia to address, including, and this is not an exhaustive list, right? Abortion rights, access to quality health care, environmental justice, labor rights, equitable housing, LGBTQ+ rights, racial justice, mass incarceration, and of course, our ongoing struggle for democracy, a topic we will discuss in detail tonight. I want to thank Beth Manchester, our Senior Associate Director of the Holder Initiative, for putting this event together, and for our Student Advisory Board and volunteers who made this event happen. And thank you all for coming. At this time, I want to call up to the podium Yosef Surratt, Henry L. and Lucy G. Moses Professor and Vice President for Undergraduate Education at Columbia. Yosef is a leading scholar of the African American religious experience. Some of his publications include the outstanding book, Spirit in the Dark, A Religious History of Racial Aesthetics, and the recently released edited volume, The Sexual Politics of Black Churches, among other publications. I've had the pleasure of working with him as colleagues in the newly created, still new, African American and African Diaspora Studies Department, and now I have the pleasure of working with him in his new capacity as the Dean of Columbia College. Please join me in welcoming Dean Yosef Surratt.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to follow Frank to the podium. As we were joking backstage, I also followed him to the college as he was announced as the new executive director of the Holder Initiative about a month before I was announced as dean. So any day I'm following in Frank's footsteps is a good day. I want to thank Frank for that warm and generous introduction, and also express my enthusiasm regarding his appointment as the new executive director of the Holder Initiative. I want to echo Frank also in expressing my gratitude to Beth Manchester, to everyone in attendance, and especially to our special guest and author this evening. I have to sort of wear two hats, and I want to acknowledge all of the students in my fall course, Intro to African American Studies, who were not even in need of a gentle nudge to attend this evening's event. They were just ready to be here, taking notes, and no extra credit or any incentives were provided for them to be here. Thank them for being here as well. And I just want to also say on behalf of Columbia College how proud we are to be the institutional home for the Eric H. Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights. The Holder Initiative is significant for any number of reasons that Frank has already begun to delineate, not the least being the way in which it opens up our core curriculum to a broader set of questions about the world. In particular, thinking about courses like Contemporary Civilization that lead us through a history of debates, but most importantly, ask our students not just what it is they need to know or learn, but who it is they want to be and what it is they want this world to be as they enter from our classrooms out to campus and into the world. Emblematic of the journey of every student during their time in the college and here as undergraduates in Morningside Heights, insofar as we hope and are committed to cultivating students who understand the duties of civic and individual responsibility as a core part of their journey here, the Holder Initiative is at the centerpiece of what we hope our students are taking with them. And in this way, the Holder Initiative serves as a center for our students to learn to be responsible through action, to put theory into practice. It's my pleasure and ask that you would join me in welcoming Professor Frank Guridy back to the stage, and with him, our special guest for the evening, former Attorney General and member of the Columbia College class of 1973, Eric Holder, for tonight's celebration of and conversation about his most recent book, Our Unfinished March. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to introduce this is the first event of our year, but it's the 19th installment of the American Voting Project, which is part of a foundational part of the Holder Initiative's programming since it began in 2017. It's a discussion series that brings together leading scholars, politicians, journalists, activists, students, and community members to explore key issues that influence American voting today. And tonight, which marks the 19th installment of that series, I have the distinct honor of welcoming back to Columbia the former Attorney General, Eric Holder, who was, of course, the class of 1973 at the college and also of the law school, 1976. And as an undergraduate, I will point out, if you don't mind, he was part of an extraordinary, I think, generation of extraordinary student activists who helped create substantial changes on this campus during the late 1960s and early 1970s. And most importantly, like me, he's a native New Yorker of Caribbean heritage. So that's the takeaway for tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about this outstanding book, Our Unfinished March, The Violent Past and Imperiled Future of the Vote, written with Sam Koppelman and published by One World earlier this year. The book is a clear-eyed and unflinching analysis of the ongoing struggle for voting rights in the United States. Like the good history major that he was here at Columbia, Holder provides an insightful historical account of the struggle for voting rights since the nation's inception. And drawing upon his distinguished career in the law, and of course from his perspective as a former Attorney General, he offers a sobering analysis of the intensifying attacks on our democracy in recent years. The book also provides, of course, not just an analysis, it actually offers a persuasive plan of action to expand and protect our democracy in the present and the future. Eric, thank you for coming. How are you tonight?
I'm doing just fine. Always good to come home. Although I was telling the dean, you could have just said I was a graduate, and you too could have just said I was a graduate of the college. You didn't have to say the year, because all these people are like, damn, this dude is old.
It's hard for me not to talk about years. I'm a historian.
All right, that's fine.
And speaking of that, when I first learned about this book, when I met you briefly in the spring, I knew I wanted to talk with you about it, so I'm really, really delighted that you came back to talk with us here at Columbia about it today. There's so much ground to cover, and I want to give an opportunity for the audience to ask questions toward the end, but I want to get right to it, if you don't mind. And as you know, so I'm the historian, so I have to ask you a historical question, if you don't mind. I suspect most people want to get right into the contemporary, but I want to kind of walk us through chronologically, if you don't mind. I was pleasantly surprised to read the history that you provide in this book. I have to admit, I was kind of expecting a kind of Martin Luther King-esque, Barack Obama-esque, long arc of history inevitably bending toward justice kind of narrative, right? One that positions the Constitution as a document that provides us a blueprint for us to build upon, or for us to follow, not build upon, right? On the contrary, drawing from the work of historians of voting rights, this book says the exact opposite. As you write on pages 218 to 219, quote, anyone who tells you progress is inevitable is mistaken. Demography is not destiny. Moral acts don't bend with certainty. History is not a Marvel movie. The good guys lose as often as they win. Since our nation's founding, the journey of American democracy has moved in every direction. We've gone forward and backward, seen it wiped away, and through it all, the right to vote has never been sacred. Right? Those lines, there are a lot of lines like that in this book, throughout the book. So by taking us through the stories of numerous individuals, the Jimmy Jacksons, the Seth Luthers, the Alice Pauls, among many, many others in this book, who fought to expand the franchise, the book offers us, I think, an account of struggle, right? That would make any historian of social movements like me smile. So here's my question. Tell me about the decision to approach U.S. history from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it's a realistic way to look at our nation's history and our nation's history when it comes to democracy, because too often it is as if a bunch of folks got together, declared independence from Great Britain, and a significant thing, greatest empire in the history of in the world at that time, win a Revolutionary War, Articles of Confederation, constitutions put in place, and then 1965 Voting Rights Act, and everything's really been good all the way. Women get the right to vote. And the reality is this has been a constant struggle about whose voice is heard, whose voice counts. There has been as much failure as there has been progress. There have been people pushing for inclusion, for diversity, for the expansion of rights, while at the same time there have been forces pushing against those very things. This nation is, I think, still in the process of this American experiment of ours is one that is ongoing. It's one where we have at times succeeded, at other times we have failed, and we tend to focus on the success at the expense of examining the failures, and in doing that, I think we decrease the possibilities that the future will be that which we want it to be. So I wanted to talk about, at the end of the day, I think it's an optimistic book, but I wanted to make sure that people understood that this wasn't an arc that was uninterrupted, that this was one that there was some real detours, some head scratchers. And as we researched the book, there were things that I found out about some people that I did not know, and uncovered some people who aren't too widely known.
Yeah, and I think, it sounds like even with the research, that was part of the vision all along. But given the politics of history that we've been encountering, right? So much of our battles, are about voting rights and the state of democracy, are about how we narrate the history of this country. Right. So I guess, I would say, I think it's an important intervention as somebody who was, a member of the Obama administration, who has actually had the concrete experience of struggling for voting rights, to be able to narrate the history in this way, because I think it offers us and empowers us. And I sense that's the motive behind the book, and one of the motives, right? Empowers us to follow in the footsteps of our ancestors who struggled for.
No, that's exactly right. It might seem that in the 21st century, the things that we face are insurmountable. That the forces aligned against us, the authoritarian forces aligned against us, the anti-democracy forces aligned against us, are forces that cannot be beat. That the challenges are too great. And what I try to say in the book, certainly in the first part, as I'm looking at the history of this nation, is that other people during their times faced problems, issues, forces that might have seemed insurmountable, and yet they overcame them. Not necessarily right away, but with commitment, with struggle, with sacrifice. And that, I think, is the optimistic part of the book, which is to say, essentially, yeah, it seems difficult now. We've got a kind of a runaway Supreme Court. I just saw something on the news as I was coming up here that half of the people running for office on the Republican ticket, at the state level and at the federal level, are election deniers. Yeah. Half of them. Yeah. And that might seem. Okay. I hope you all didn't miss. That was really good stuff I was just saying. And that might seem like, well, these forces, these anti-democracy forces are too great for us to overcome. How do we deal with this runaway, rogue Supreme Court? How do we deal with these election deniers? How do we deal with the presence of Donald Trump and the influence that he's having on the nation? And yet, through this book and through names known to us and unknown to us, challenges we're familiar with and those that might be revealed for the first time, you get the sense that we can handle this. We got this. We can get to a better place. It's not going to happen next week, although it could happen in a very substantial way if we do the right thing in about, 5 weeks with regard to the election that we're about to have. But there's hope. There should be hope that the ideals expressed in our founding documents we can actually get to that place.
Yeah, no, that comes through clearly, and I want to circle back to some of those points a little later. The book really takes us through. It's a very, through these stories, takes us from the founding, right, of the nation, up into, through the struggle to abolish slavery, the Reconstruction period, which clearly the influence of your Columbia University education is evident there, as you mentioned in the book when you took your class at Eric Foner. And then, of course, the suffragist movement and the limits of that movement, right, and the ways in which it produced, rights and suffrage for white women while women of color were left behind. Then we go to the 1960s and leading to of course, to the foundational Voting Rights Act of 1965. I have to ask just real quick, though, I love the kind of autobiographical moments in the book. And I have the image that you provide us in the book of you watching the events transpiring in the South from, on TV as a 12-year-old in New York City. And you talking about the ways in which even as Jim Crow racism seemed distant to you as somebody in the North, nonetheless, what you saw, was inspiring and moved you. So I wanted to talk. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, and also about the decision to include that in the narrative.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I thought we wanted to try to make this book accessible. The first couple of attempts at it. I remember looking at the first couple of chapters that I wrote, and it read like, and this is with all due respect to people who are on the law review, it read like a law review article. And those can be very interesting and very compelling, but that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted a non-lawyer to be able to pick up this book and find it interesting, find it accessible. And so the personal, I thought, was a good way to do it, both in terms of the stories of people that identified in the historical part, and then as you get to the more contemporary stuff, to talk about how I observed these things in my younger years. So I'm born in 1951. That's right, start calculating. Ooh, okay. Born in 1951, and 1963 is a big year. A whole range of things happen. President Kennedy is assassinated in November, but a young woman named Vivian Malone, in June of 1963, integrates the University of Alabama, and with George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door. Well, her younger sister becomes my wife, and who is the mother of the young woman sitting here, who's my daughter. And so there's that. There is the day that Vivian integrates the University of Alabama, President Kennedy gives this great speech about that. Later that night, Medgar Evers is assassinated in his driveway in Mississippi. And so, I remember that day and that night, and reading about Medgar Evers the next day, and the loss of those civil rights workers, Cheney, Schwerner, Goodman, and the search for them, and how, although I was, in Queens, looking at all of this stuff on a small black and white TV in the basement of our small house, and thinking this seemed really kind of strange to me because it was inconsistent with my existence in New York City, but yet this was my nation, this was my country. And thinking to myself, in some way, I want to be a part of the movement, because there are these brave people like Vivian, freedom marchers, the freedom riders, the people who are at the March on Washington. I was too young for all of that stuff, but I said, I want to be a part of that. I want to be in some way a part of that that army for positive change. And so talking about it, and describing that feeling as a 12-year-old, all the way up through some of the things that I did and protests that I was engaged in, even as late as as Attorney General, and making a decision that I wasn't going to argue a case before the Supreme Court after a certain court decision. That's kind of been that's who I became, who I was, who I became, and that this university, this college, helped really kind of nurture, and it's why I have this enduring affection for this place.
Yeah, and of course you start the book, of course, with you going to Selma in 2015, right, with the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the famous march across the Pettus Bridge. And so, I mean, and that's, you start there, but in some ways that's kind of the pivot point, the 1965 moment, right? Which, of course, the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 which, as the book shows, right, unleashes a tidal wave of enfranchisement unprecedented in American history. You know, the lowering of the voting age from 21 to 18 during the Vietnam War, and years later, the 1984 Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, among other important legislative political moments in the 1970s and 80s, right? And that takes us to, you know, the second half of the book, which really starts in the Obama era, moving to the present, right? So the book shifts really to our current crisis, right? Which the book traces to the election of Barack Obama, or the reaction, I should say, to the election of Barack Obama. You write that when you were sworn in as Attorney General, you didn't think that protecting the franchise was going to be on the top of your agenda, right? You then write in the book about the key moments during the Obama presidency that led you to prioritize voting rights, right? During your time as AG, and then obviously since then, right? So can you talk about, or take us through a couple of the key moments in that period that you describe in the book?
Yeah, I mean, when I became Attorney General back in 2009, I thought the primary focus that I was going to have was national security issues. What do we do with Guantanamo? Where do the 9/11, suspects get tried? A whole range of things. I mean, people tend to forget how, on a day-to-day basis, we were concerned about terrorism. Yes. And so the Justice Department, I sat on the National Security Council, spent a lot of time in the Situation Room. I had a range of things that I wanted to emphasize. Criminal justice reform was something that I wanted to be involved in. And I thought, yeah, you know, there is in the Civil Rights Division an election section, and I thought, you know, there'll certainly be things to do there, and we'll focus on that. But I didn't think it was going to be the primary thing, or one of the primary things that I was going to spend my time doing. And yet, President Obama is elected in 2008, takes office in 2009, gets the shellacking, as he describes, in the midterms in 2010, right before the redistricting that is done in 2011. And what happened with that redistricting and the empowerment of Republicans in state legislatures across the country as a result of those defeats in 2010 really brought to the fore the need to make democracy protection, protection of the right to vote, something that I had to focus on, because Republicans used that power that they generated in 2011 through the redistricting process in 2012 to come up with a whole range of things. And you think about it, one marker of that, 2012, first election after the redistricting of 2011, after the shellacking in 2010, Democrats get 1.4 million more votes than Republicans for the United States House of Representatives and end up with a 33-seat deficit. 1.4 million more votes, 33 seats below the majority. And all scholars have looked at it and said, you know, it's as a result of gerrymandering. And so, and that had a whole range of effects. Certainly at the state level, the Congress then became one that did not want to cooperate with the president, didn't want to cooperate with me. I mean, my life after that election in 2012 really changed. I spent a lot of time testifying, as Merrick Garland, I think, can expect to do if the House flips this year. Spent on a lot of extraneous, nonsensical TV moment things. And so, but that's not that as important as what we saw Republicans do with that power, to put into place unnecessary photo ID laws, to make it more difficult for people to vote, for closing polling places, a whole range of things that I thought as Attorney General I need to prioritize, and I need to use the weight of the Justice Department to oppose.
But then something happens in 2013.
2013, there's a case called Shelby County versus Holder. Now, if you want to piss me off, you will call it the Shelby County versus Holder case. It is, if you want to stay on my good side, you simply call it the Shelby County case. Because I don't want my name ever associated with that case. That's like being, Dred Scott versus Holder. You wouldn't want your name associated with that case. Korematsu versus Holder. You wouldn't want your name associated with that case. And so the Shelby County case happens in 2013 by a 5-4 majority. The Supreme Court, in essence, guts a substantial part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is the crown jewel of the civil rights movement,
and essentially takes away the pre-clearance authority that the Justice Department has. Kind of break this down, not too legalistically here. There are certain parts of the country under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, primarily but not exclusively, the Old South. When you wanted to make an electoral change in the Old South, you had to go to the Justice Department to get approval. It's called pre-clearance. So if you wanted to close a polling place, you had to get our approval. If you wanted to move a polling place, if you wanted to institute some new requirement in order to vote, you had to get our approval. And most of the things that were sought were in fact approved, contrary to what the court said in the opinion. But in any case, in this 5-4 decision, Chief Justice Roberts wrote that America has changed. And as a result, this pre-clearance ability that the Justice Department had was not really necessary. And so, again, for technical reasons having to do with coverage and all that, essentially took it away from the Justice Department. And you saw almost immediately states taking advantage of that, the Justice Department no longer there, dad's no longer in the house, oh, let's go to town. 1,700 polling places closed around the country, disproportionate numbers of them in communities of color, purges of people on voting rolls, again, disproportionately in places people of color. And the really going to town when it comes to this need for photo ID to deal with this that we're still talking about, election fraud. We hear election denial, which is all election fraud. Texas, for instance, says, all right, they put in a law, you've got to have a state-issued photo ID in order to vote. You got to prove who you are in order to vote. And I think that's fine. You should prove who you are, but not necessarily in the prescriptive way that they said. All right, so state-issued photo ID. If you show up with a photo ID in Texas that says you're allowed to carry a concealed weapon, cool, you can vote. If you have a state-issued photo ID that says you're a student at the University of Texas, nope, not good enough. So they're making a judgment there. They're saying, all right, the guy, the woman who carries a gun, probably kind of like us, okay, yeah, you can vote. These, socialist, communist, libertarian, whatever they are, young people, well, let's make it more difficult, for them to vote. So that's what the 2013 Shelby County case was about. And I think interestingly, the late Justice Ginsburg, who has Columbia connections, said that, the decision that the majority rendered was like taking away, in the middle of a thunderstorm, you got an umbrella over your head, and you're staying dry in that thunderstorm, and saying, well, hey, I'm dry in this thunderstorm, so I can take down the umbrella. And what happens? You ultimately get wet. And her thought essentially was, America has changed and things are better, but it's because of the Voting Rights Act. And if you take the Voting Rights Act away, America is going to be, when it comes to voting and democracy, not the place that we want it to be. And history has shown that she was prophetic, and that with all due respect, the Chief Justice was fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was living and working in Texas at the time. I was teaching at the University of Texas, Austin, so I remember those laws very, very vividly. Being in Austin, the liberal bubble, supposedly, of Texas. And so, and you could see that, the effect, immediately.
There was also a provision in Texas that people with locks could not vote.
Is that right?
No, I'm making that up.
I didn't have locks at the time.
I'm making that up. That's not true. That's not true. I'm making that up.
But you never know.
I was making that up.
Anything could happen in Texas. I didn't have locks then, so they might have let me vote. So that's as I read the book, that's a pivotal point.
That's a pivotal case and a pivotal moment. Yes.
Along with all the other anti-democratic voting attempts to circumscribe the vote.
What's interesting about that especially is that the Voting Rights Act had been passed in 1965, reauthorized a number of times, almost always close to unanimously, and reauthorized and signed by a Republican president every time. There was a kind of a uniformity, a belief that the crown jewel of the civil rights movement needed to be held in place. It had actually been expanded. Some of the covered jurisdictions, actually in parts of New York State, were actually covered by the Voting Rights Act. But this Supreme Court decision made it possible for those in opposition to the Voting Rights Act, who we thought were in the distinct minority, to in essence say, oh, okay, let's no longer have to worry about the Justice Department. Supreme Court says that we can do the things that we want to do. Let's go at it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this is a sobering book, right? And you've given us a sense of it already, right? I mean, you write early on in the book, and I've seen other people ask you this question and underline this quote, but I will do it myself. You write, the book says, American democracy is on the brink of collapse. It's on page 16, right? But as you said earlier, this is a book that doesn't simply describe a crisis or analyze a crisis very persuasively. It does offer a series of actionable things to do, right? Items that we could take up right now to address the crisis as it manifests itself in the legislative branch, the judicial, and the executive branches, right? So I'd like you to talk a little bit about or highlight what you think are some of those essential things that can be done, right? Because that makes up much of the latter parts of the book. Sure.
I mean, I think just to start, that notion that our democracy is under attack is, I think, manifestly clear. When you see election deniers running for, these critical election-deciding positions, that should give us pause. There's no question that a lot of the things that have been put in place are, again, anti-democracy in nature. So yeah, I think our democracy is under attack. Our democracy is on the verge of collapse, but it need not collapse. I mean, that's the thing. It need not collapse. And to the extent that we think, America's always been a democracy, and therefore it always will be one. We need to examine history and look at what happened in Europe, in the 20th century, where fascism rose, not necessarily because fascism was strong, but because the defense of democracy was weak. And if we are weak in the defense of democracy this time, it doesn't mean we'll have a dictator, but you could end up with elections every 2 years, 4 years, 6 years that are essentially rendered meaningless. And so that's what is at stake. And so I have a number of proposals. I mean, among them, Supreme Court. We need to limit the term. They need term limits in the Supreme Court. At the beginning of the Republic, people left the Supreme Court because they had to, because they died. They died. People, life tenure, people didn't live as long. Now we have justices who time their retirements, and this is Democrats as well as Republicans, they time their retirements at a time when a president who's of their ideological liking will have the opportunity to pick their successors. And people in these unelected positions, now with our longer life terms, longer life expectancy, will serve 30, 40 years in an unelected position. That's just too long for one person. So I said we should have them serve 18-year terms. Interestingly, Chief Justice Roberts, and he and I disagree on a whole bunch of stuff, he also agrees. And I have that in the book as well. He says they should serve 15 years. All right, I'll give them an extra 3. I came up with 18 because I thought 3 senatorial terms, 18 years would make sense. And if you also go with the second part of the proposal, which is that a president would appoint a Supreme Court justice in his or her first year in a term, and also in his or her third year in a term. So 2 appointments, first year and third year, and do that every term, and you have 18-year terms, you would ultimately get to a court that would be back down to 9 members. And I say back down to 9 members because I think we have to expand the court in the short term. In the first instance, to deal with 2 seats that were stolen by Mitch McConnell and his band of merry men in the Senate. The notion that Merrick Garland didn't get a hearing because it was too close to the election, all right, that's a new rule, never heard of that one before. And then Amy Coney Barrett is put on the court while people are in the process of voting. So inconsistent with the non-existent Merrick Garland rule, no consistency there. So in any case, those are 2 seats that I think need to be dealt with, and the court should be expanded by at least 2 members. The last time the court was expanded, it was to have the same number of justices as we have circuit courts, appellate courts in the United States. And if we did that, that would mean the court would be expanded by 4. So anywhere between 2 and 4, I think we should expand. We need to do away with the filibuster in the Senate. I think Election Day should be a national holiday. I think we should guarantee 14 days of early voting across the country, at least 14 days of early voting across the country. Automatic registration. When you're 18 years of age, you should automatically be registered, because we find that people who are registered to vote tend to vote. Registration is too difficult in too many places. Do away with the Electoral College. You know, this notion that somehow, some way, I mean, the founders didn't necessarily trust us ordinary citizens to, you know, decide who should actually run the country, so they put the Electoral College in place. And we've seen in recent past, on 2 occasions, you know, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, who did not win the popular vote, who nevertheless became president. And so that would require a constitutional amendment, unless we follow this thing called the National Voter Compact, which would say that all of the states would agree to cast their electoral votes not for who won the state vote, but who won the national vote. And if you get enough states totaling 270 to do that, that would mean that the popular vote winner would actually become president. And at this point, we have about 192 electoral votes from states that have agreed to do this. And these last 70 or so are going to be difficult to get. But that's something, I think, that's one way in which we could do away with the Electoral College. So those are among the things that I say that we should do to try to perfect our democracy and make our system of government more representative of the people that it's supposed to serve.
So in the arguments that you make in that section of the book, I mean, you're very cognizant, and you say it in the book, says it over and over again about, you know, how many people are demoralized and frustrated and extremely angry and quite frankly pessimistic that any of these things could be accomplished. So can you talk a little bit more about how, you know, either whether it's in a specific recommendation that you're making here about, you know, how specific can we get around the kind of the you know, the failures of the Senate and Congress? I mean, how do we deal with even just sort of the pessimism that might inspire people to you know, to really push forward with some of these reforms?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I understand the pessimism, but we can't let the pessimism be something that so infuses us that it results in inaction on our part. I mean, if you look at the people who I talk about in the book, the suffragettes, there's women fighting for the right to vote. They had to try to imagine an America that they had never seen, imagine an America that had never existed. And I'm sure that a lot of those suffragettes thought, boy, are we ever going to really be able to pull this off? I'm sure that Dr. King, as they're in the process of destroying a system of American apartheid and to try to guarantee the right to vote for, you know, for African Americans that had been granted after the Civil War and essentially stolen after that. I'm sure there must have been moments when he thought, along with, you know, Diane Nash and John Lewis, other people, that, you know, can we really destroy a system of American apartheid? But they didn't become, you know, pessimistic. They became, they pushed through that. And that's in essence what we have to do now. As I said at the beginning, there are a whole bunch of reasons why I think we should be or could be pessimistic, but pessimism leads to inaction, and we can't allow that to happen. I think we've got to be grounded in history and see what other generations have done, and resolve that this generation will rise to the challenges that it faces and be as successful as previous generations have been. Be optimistic. You know, in some ways, you know, faith is a belief in that which you don't have, you know, proof of. And I have faith in our system, faith in our democracy, faith in our capacity as regular American citizens to bring about the changes that we need. So that the litany of things that I propose is long, and people will say, "All right, come on, what do you're not going to be able to, you know, do all of that." Well, maybe not all of it, but maybe 98% of it, and maybe not in the first year, but over time, with continued effort, continued focus, continued commitment, it can happen.
Yeah, and even in 2020, one of the interesting things because of the pandemic is that in some ways it became easier to vote, right? Which accounted for, it resulted in this extraordinary voter turnout, one of the largest in American history. One of the things that I did, I was part of a study with some political scientists that looked at the impact of the conversion of stadiums and arenas into voting centers. And what was astonishing in our research is how easy that was done, right? I mean, partly because we're in a social distancing moment, but it's very clear that even in sports entities and election officials partnered in very productive ways to sort of make voting easier for Americans. It's actually one of the interesting consequences of 2020.
Yeah, I mean, the notion that, vote by mail became something that people used around the country. And, what we have seen, all the studies have shown that if you employ vote by mail, it increases the turnout. More people will participate in the system. But interestingly, it doesn't favor one party or the other. Doesn't help Democrats, doesn't help Republicans more, but it does increase turnout. And why would anybody be opposed to that? This notion that we hear from Republicans now that, well, it increases the chances of voter fraud. There's no proof of that. There's no proof of that. I mean, the Brennan Center, as I quote in the book, says you're more likely to be hit by lightning than to cast a fraudulent ballot. That's just the reality. And as you were saying, through some, really, I talked about a guy named Chris Hollins in Harris County in Texas, young man who really kind of put in place a lot of these measures, opening up, sports stadiums for voting, coming up with around-the-clock voting so that people didn't have to choose between, do I go to work or do I vote? Drop boxes, so you don't have to wait in line. You just drive up in your car and drop off your ballot. A whole range of things that are just kind of logical and increase the participation of the American people in the system. So those are the kinds of really practical things that we can do to increase the number of people who participate. And again, all of this stuff was done in 2020, as you say, biggest turnout we've ever had in the history of the nation, with no discernible vote fraud. This notion that somehow, some way, the election was rigged, stolen, people who won elections were denied legitimate victories is simply bullshit. Is nonsense.
The New Yorker talking. See?
It's nonsense. Nonsense. Yeah, it's nonsense. There's actually a quote in there from Stringer Bell.
Yes,
So
you quoted Stringer
you can-
Bell, the very famous character from
Yeah.
the show from back in the day. Listen
That's
to
what
me.
I'm most
The
proud
Wire.
of. In some ways, that's what I'm most proud of in the book. I got a quote from Stringer Bell in a book about democracy,
Stringer Bell was a sharp cat.
He's a sharp cat.
He really was. He really, among many on that show.
And there's a way I got an F-bomb in the book as well, so that was good.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I have one more question for you before we turn it over to the audience. And what we're going to do is I think I could see everybody. We have some people running mics around, and then we'll direct the person with the mic to the questioner. But I have one more for the former Attorney General. So I said I'm a social movement historian, right? And I think that one of the things that this book does really well is that, again, it highlights these individuals, like all the people we've talked about, Frederick Douglass and some well-known people, John Lewis, of course, obviously, but many lesser knowns who did extraordinary activism for the vote, right? But they were part of movements, right? Which you talk about for sure, right? But I feel like this question I just have to ask. It seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that Republicans do a much better job of mobilizing their foot soldiers than the Democratic Party, as far as I could see. Right? This is just my impression. I'm not an insider at all, so I could be dead wrong. Democrats know how to get people out to vote. But then once they're elected into office, I think we've seen this over and over again, they seem to do everything in their power to demobilize and even delegitimize some of their supporters, right? Particularly progressives, once they get into office. I mean, look at what we've seen, look at how they've handled the momentum that was extraordinary momentum that was generated by the protests of 2020, right? Which, in my view, they've sort of squandered away, right? In some ways, among other moments, even at the local level with respect to police violence and abolition and those sorts of questions. So, I'd like to get your impressions on that. Like, how do we keep people engaged beyond Election Day, right? Because it seems to me that January 6th proved, right? I mean, that was an election context, but we've seen over and over again how right-wingers are mobilized, not just when it's election time. And it seems to me that the party could do, and I think progressives could do a better job, keep people engaged, right, and mobilized, and part of a bigger movement than just simply electing people to office.
No, that's an excellent point. I mean, we can't, as Democrats, as progressives, get enthused about the civic life of this country every 4 years, every time there's a president, up for election. We have got to play the long game. in a way that Republicans have frankly done better than we have. It's not just about an election every 4 years that should animate us. We should be involved, engaged in this stuff, all the time. And, Will Rogers once said, I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat, And we have got to get more organized, more focused, and keep these issues, work on them, day by day, and think about, I hate the expression, down ballot races as if they are less important. But the reality is that, those people who serve in state legislatures have an impact on your life on a day-to-day basis way more than who the president of the United States is. I mean, if you look at these anti-choice laws, these draconian anti-abortion laws that are being passed, they're being passed by state legislators, And the Supreme Court has the ability to do what it's doing because it's looking at a statute passed by state legislators. And so we've got to focus on not only the federal offices, but, all the way down to now, given what they're trying to do, who serves on our election commissions at the local level, who serves as mayor. And we've got to play the long game. I mean, I'm the head of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. We just went through this redistricting cycle. We were very successful. The natural inclination of Democrats would be to say, hey, great job, Eric. We'll give you some plaques, man. We're gonna some pats on the back, and you close up shop. But no, I said, no, that's not the deal. We're gonna stay in, as an organization, we're gonna stay focused on these issues. There are gonna be things we have to do with redistricting over the next couple of years, but we're actually gonna get ready for 2031, the next time that we have to redistrict. And that's the kind of thing that I think has to be replicated. Again, Democrats, progressives have got to learn to play the long game.
Yeah, and to really zero in on those local state, because I mean that's as you said, that's what accounts for so much of the Republican resurgence is their effectiveness on that level. Right. Yeah. Great. Okay, so we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. I would like to ask you ask a question. Don't make a speech. And to keep your question as short as you can so we can get to as many as possible. So I see a hand over here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. The Supreme Court is taking up the independent legislature theory in Moore v. Harper, and how concerned are you that the Supreme Court is going to uphold that theory, and then if that occurs, what do we do as people who want to support and protect American democracy?
Yeah, well, I think I've got some options, one of which is the son of a man who was born in Barbados. I have citizenship in Barbados. So if that becomes the law,
lucky you.
I might be checking out Brooke. That's my daughter. I might be getting on a plane and going to Barbados. But more seriously, that's a case that is actually, it's one of our cases, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. That's one of our cases. The Alabama case that was argued yesterday was one of our cases. But this other case, the Moore case, the independent state legislature doctrine, which essentially says that legislatures can draw lines, gerrymander, they can draw the lines for the districts, they can gerrymander without being reviewed by state courts and governors as well. I mean, the independent legislatures themselves can do a whole range of things. That worries me a great deal. You know, that's inconsistent for, I don't know, you law students remember this little case called Marbury versus Madison? This notion of, you know, the courts decide what the laws are and review what state legislatures do. They want to say that, no, when it comes to drawing the lines, election stuff, that the legislatures do these things independently. It challenges in a fundamental way our system of checks and balances. But here's the other danger. The language that is contained there that they cite for this independent state legislature doctrine with regard to redistricting is very similar to other language in the Constitution. This is a couple pages up, a couple paragraphs up, that talks about state legislatures picking the electors to the electoral college. And if you're saying, well, wait a minute, the state legislatures can pick the electors to the electoral college without the courts being involved, without governors being involved, you can see that all kinds of mischief. In these gerrymandered state legislatures, you could see these state legislatures doing something inconsistent with what the voters in their states said. So I'm concerned about the case itself, but I'm also concerned that if the court finds the ability to say that this is valid, what that might mean for that other part of the Constitution. And here's the deal. This is a fringe theory. This theory is ridiculous. This theory is absurd. The Supreme Court should throw this out 9-zip. Anything less than that even if we win this case, if we win this case 5-4 or something like that, that would be a big disappointment to me. It would mean that 4 justices somehow, some way believed that the independent state legislature doctrine was valid. And that would be absurd. And we've heard all this talk about the legitimacy of the court in the last couple of weeks. That would, I think, give fuel to the notion that you have ideologues as opposed to justices serving on the Supreme Court. This should be a 9-0 case. I mean, it really should be 9-zip.
Question over here, all the way over here.
Hi, thank you. I'm glad we got on the Supreme Court issue so quickly because I think that's been on a lot of people's minds lately. So a question I had was, in the context of the really controversial cases that they're hearing, do you think the day is coming where the rulings of the Supreme Court will no longer be obeyed? And is that a better outcome than the worst ruling they could hand down?
No, I don't think that's adherence to what the court says is part of the American DNA. But that doesn't mean that what the court says has to necessarily be accepted. There are ways, Congress has not done this nearly as much as it has done in the past, where Congress can overrule substantial things that the court says. For instance, the court says in the Shelby County case, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, in a lot of ways, in a substantial way, was unconstitutional. I fear what they might do with regard to the case they heard yesterday about the Alabama gerrymandering and say, Section 2 is unconstitutional. Congress can come into session and pass a new Voting Rights Act, take into account what the Supreme Court says, but in essence, overrule the court. That's, again, that notion of checks and balances. The Supreme Court, in a decision, the Rucho decision, said that you can't bring partisan gerrymandering cases in federal court. All right, we said, well, that's fine. We'll bring the cases then in state courts, and we'll use the state constitutions to challenge partisan and racial gerrymandering. That's the case that they're trying to now. They're trying to take that tool away from us as well. So I don't think the court will be or should be ignored, but the other components in our government at the federal level as well as at the state level should understand the power that exists in those other branches and then use that power to check the court when the court does things that I think are inconsistent with precedent, inconsistent with principle, and are a function of personnel. That's what I really worry about. I mean, the court has got, people say it's partisan. I don't think it's necessarily overly partisan. I think it's overly ideological. And I think that this runaway rogue court, I think, as I've described it, is just not the final say. It is just one branch of government, and I think that the other branches need to respond to it. But to ignore it, I think, I guess it was Jackson who famously said, well, court rule this way, let them try to enforce it. What army does the Supreme Court have? The Supreme Court, that's why the legitimacy of the court is so important, so that it is not seen as so illegitimate that that thought starts to germinate in people's minds. We'll simply ignore what the court says. But I don't think that's likely to happen. But the other branches and the other components in our system need to be more responsive.
Yeah, I mean, the Dobbs decision just affirmed, this comes out before Dobbs, and it just affirmed everything you were saying about the court, in the book. There's a hand back here, behind you, right behind you. Yeah.
Mr. Attorney General, when we spoke 2 years ago here at the Renzo Piano evening, I mentioned to you that I had worked as a very young man for Elliot Richardson. and you said that there was a tradition in the Department of Justice for an incoming Attorney General to choose one of his predecessors' portrait to hang on the wall. But you broke the rule, as usual, and ordered 2 portraits to be hung in your office, one of Elliot Richardson and one of Robert Kennedy. Would you speak, please, about what it meant to have them looking over your shoulder in their office and you're sitting in their chair, and more importantly, what they mean to you today?
Yeah, actually, that's not quite right. What happens is an attorney general, you got this big conference room, and you pick 4 of your predecessors' portraits to put up. And I had Bobby Kennedy, Nick Katzenbach, Elliot Richardson, and Robert Jackson up there. And I think in a lot of ways it's an important decision because it says a lot about who the attorney general is, who you decide, to put up there. I would be fascinated to see if an attorney general 10, 15 years from now puts the portrait up of Bill Barr. That would be like, I'd be like, whoa, what? You got him up there? And Elliot Richardson, to me, a Republican, and people wondered about that. This Democratic Attorney General had this Republican AG up there. But Elliot Richardson, to me, embodied who you're supposed to be as Attorney General. You're a person who is not the lawyer for the president. You're not the lawyer for the federal government. In some ways you are. But you're basically the attorney for the people. And when Nixon ordered him to fire the special Watergate counsel, he said no and got fired as a result. He lost his job because he did the right thing. And the portrait was there, for me at least, to remind me that the job was less important than doing the right thing. Now, I had a good president. Barack Obama was never going to order me to do anything I think inappropriate, so I never had to face that choice. Having Bobby Kennedy there mattered to me because he reminded me of the power of the Justice Department to be a force for good. Yeah, you have to you have to enforce the laws, but there's a moral component to the job, as well. And his stand for and his pushing his brother towards the support of civil rights demonstrators, civil rights laws, the moral positions that he took in a whole number of places was why he was there for me. We can learn a lot from our predecessors, both good and bad. I tried to pattern myself of it after some, and certainly those 2. There were others who acted in ways that I thought were inconsistent with what a good attorney general should do, and so I tried to avoid repeating the mistakes that that they made. It'll be interesting to see 30, 40 years from now, what do they do with my portrait? Where does that end up? So we'll see.
It'll be on somebody's wall. Okay, we have time for one more question. To the back there. I think it was in the back there. There was a hand back there I thought I saw. No? Up here then? Okay, I guess not. Okay.
All right, sorry about that. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to read your book. My question is about the maps drawn for New York after this most recent census cycle. Obviously, they got thrown out. There was a district that connected Staten Island to Park Slope. My question is, do the Democrats have a moral imperative when civil rights and the future of the climate are at stake to draw maps that get more Democrats elected, to essentially use the same tactics that Republicans have been using for years?
Yeah, you see, I don't think Democrats need to do that. I mean, when we formed up the NDRC, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, we said we want the maps to be drawn in a fair way. The thought being, if they're done in a fair way, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. We'll do just fine. Recent assessments have said that 75% of the maps that were drawn were, by traditional standards, deemed to be fair. Really substantial increase from what happened over the course of the last decade. Now, that also means that 25% were done in an unfair way. And in this really divided country of ours, that could really determine, who wins control of the House of Representatives. And the 25% are chiefly found in Republican-controlled places. Texas, Georgia, Florida, Wisconsin. you see some really gerrymandered maps there. So I don't think that we need to do that which Republicans have done. Our fight was for fair maps. And if the maps are fair, I think we got better candidates. I think we have better positions. But the stakes are extremely high. The stakes are extremely high. We're talking about what this nation looks like in terms of reproductive rights, in terms of climate, in terms of criminal justice reform, in terms of democracy protection. There's a whole range of things that we have to consider in casting a vote this November. Inflation, the availability of baby formula, and a whole range of other stuff. There's nothing I think more important than democracy. Democracy is on the ballot this November, and I think that is the thing that should animate everybody. And maybe this is where I'll end. And some of you probably heard me say this before. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. Great phrase. But here's the deal. It doesn't bend on its own. It only bends when people like us, when people like you, especially you young people, put their hands on that arc. That's what bends the arc. When you put your hand on that arc and you pull it towards justice. And so what I think each and every one of you have to ask yourselves is, what are you doing to pull that arc, bend that arc towards justice? You can't expect that the cavalry is going to come and save us. There is no cavalry. You are the cavalry. Your generation, young people are now the biggest voting bloc in the country. Boomers, you guys are always making fun of boomers. All right. I'm a boomer. Boomers, we are now baby boomers. We are now outnumbered by the younger generation, but we have more power than you because we vote in greater proportions than you all do. And so the power that you all have has to be used because it is your future that we're talking about. What's this earth going to look like in terms of climate? The most important issue I think that we face. What's this earth going to look like? If you all don't vote, people who are beholden to fossil fuel industries, who are less concerned about climate, will serve. You all can put in place the right people to decide issues in the right way, but that power has to be used. And so what I think each and every one of you, I hope you will all read the book. There's going to be a test December 15th at 3 o'clock, and so I hope you all do well on the test. No, it's not going to be a test. But I hope you all read the book, be moved by the book and maybe this conversation and in the classes that you all have here at this great institution to figure out ways in which you're going to be involved in the civic life of this nation. And it could mean supporting a candidate, it could mean running for office, it could mean a whole range of things, but find a way to be engaged, find a way to be involved. We have the power to shape this nation. We still have that power. But if we don't use that power, others who are less idealistic, less committed, less focused on a more equitable and just America will shape the nation in which you all have to live. But we can do this. We can do this.
And in earlier moments of American history, as the book says, it's been done, right? I mean, and again, it's because of struggle that we've had any sort of advancements that we've had in the history of this country. The book is Our Unfinished March, The Violent Past and Imperiled Future of the Vote. Eric Holder, thank you so much for joining us. Delightful to talk to you.